Anyway, we touched upon it a little bit already. It seems like the Vikings are having a big moment in pop culture right now. We have The Lost Kingdom, the show, plenty of video games such as Skyrim, all the Marvel movies. Lord of the Rings obviously contains some of this Nordic folklore as well.
Mhm.
I mentioned the Vikings, the TV show also. Why do you think this resurgence is happening right now?
Um, the time was right, I think. So in to a Scandinavian, it's actually it's not new, right? Because to us, the Viking history is ever present everywhere, all the time. Actually, to the extent where you can get sick of it. And you're like, did we not have other historical time periods that we could talk about? um, um, but if you look at the 90s, in terms of like what did pop culture attach itself to historically in Europe, well, it was the Celts, right? So you have Braveheart and a lot of other sort of fictions about insular Celts, Irish, and so on, and they become sort of like the happy, goofy historical cousins that we like to watch on TV. It also because here in the U.S. the Irish had their moment, so to speak, of getting rectified as a population group, being the second largest ethnicity essentially in the U.S. um, in terms of heritage. The Irish, well, started out in a pretty bad place, by being oppressed in the U.S. And then have gradually become more and more integrated into what what is the sense of like American, right? And with that come also these narratives, right? Mel Gibson making
Freedom.
freedom, yeah,
Yep.
exactly. And that story mirrors so much of American mythology too, so it makes perfect sense in that way.
Also, he's like
And
Australian. He's not Scottish, right?
yeah, he's Australian, right? And
But he's
yeah,
an
he's
American superstar. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
he's an American superstar. He has Scottish background,
Ah, okay. Okay. I
and
didn't know that. I
he's
apologies
Catholic.
to Mel Gibson for doubting his heritage.
And he's Catholic.
Yeah.
So all of this comes nicely together for him to make a cute little Celtic package, right? Um, and and so then we have a lull in historical fiction for a little bit in the early 2000s. 1999 is the year for awesome movies.
Matrix.
Yes, for instance, Fight Club and so on. But they're not historical, right?
Yeah.
And that's when we then see attention turning towards Vikings, and Vikings becoming the new favorite historical child of Europe in I wouldn't say Hollywood fiction, because it's not really Hollywood fiction, but it's fiction that mirrors Hollywood in a sense, right? That's what this TV show Vikings is, and so on. We have a resurgence of interest in Vikings in England in particular. And all of a sudden, and this also goes hand in hand with this sense of like Scandinavia being the best part of the world or something like that to a lot of Anglophones in general. Like you go into a bookstore in London and you find a million books about all kinds of Scandinavian concepts, and like as Scandinavians, we're just like seeing random words that we use on a daily basis all of a sudden becoming like this almost like a spiritual concept in a book about how you can best relax and how you can best enjoy nature and all that stuff, and and it's just like a feedback loop, right? Where they keep punching out these books and other stories about Scandinavia and how Scandinavia is so awesome and how Scandinavia has figured everything out and blah 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 blah. Especially mirroring in a place like the U.S., the fact that it doesn't seem like people have figured anything out these days, socially at least. Like, so so it's a nice thing to dream about, right? And then you can also dream about that past, right? And again, and you said you hadn't seen Vikings, but the show Vikings in many ways mirrors the American dream of immigration. Yeah, I call it a dream. You could also call it a mythology, essentially. This the the early spoiler alert. The early situation in Vikings is that they're like somewhere in Norway, in a place called Kattegat, and that's kind of hilarious because Kattegat is actually the sea right off the coast of Jutland, and it is not an original Scandinavian name; it's a Dutch name. Um, and can I can I say vulgar words on this podcast?
Not only can you say them, but this type of language is encouraged. Absolutely.
Okay. So the word seems to mean the asshole of a cat. So,
Well, that's oddly specific.
yes, it has something to do with sailing routes and narrow
Uh-huh.
passages for certain ships and that kind of stuff. And so the creators of the show Vikings, they were like, let's call the town that these Vikings live in Kattegat, and I find that incredibly hilarious. But going back to what I was talking about, this particular situation is that they're tired of raiding these poor Slavs to the east. Again, we have the myth of like predator prey when it comes to like Vikings and Slavs, and then they're like, I've heard these stories about a land to the west, and then they go to the west and find England, as if that didn't exist before. It's just like ridiculous. The uh, the creators of the show completely gloss over the fact that those people who become the English, they come from southern Scandinavia themselves. There's been cultural connections from the 400s and onwards between Scandinavia and the English area because of that fact. And there was never a situation where Scandinavians forgot that the British Isles existed. Like, there's always been connection between Scandinavia and the British Isles. But here they discover this new land in the West. And this is, of course, mirroring this, myth about Europeans discovering America as the land in the West. And then it rolls on from there to, essentially a narrative about Scandinavians trying to colonize and being more or less successful and accumulating more and more wealth and riches and status and so on, and creating awesome myth of that about that, right? So what that is repackaging of the immigration myth to the Americas by Europeans, set in the the fiction of the violent Scandinavian as sort of like a white archetype. I don't know if these creators of the show had distinct racial intentions here, but what they're reproducing is definitely sort of like the narrative of the whitest of white invaders claiming the world around them, right? And honestly, I don't think that's a good idea, guys. Like, what we're seeing is that feeds into fantasies of white supremacy here in the U.S. Constantly. So, yeah, again, I'd love to see a Viking Romeo instead.
Okay, fair enough.
Or a Viking hippie, a pot smoking Viking.
I mean, now we've paved the way for that kind of a character, at
I
least.
guess, yeah, we have.
Yeah.